You're listening to Your Magical Midlife. This podcast is for women who are seekers, dreamers, and out-of-the-box thinkers. If you're a Gen X woman who never quite fit in, and probably never will, listen up. I'm Kate Higgins, your host. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and coach, and I'm here to guide you through the expansive, exhilarating, and sometimes exhausting crossroads that we find ourselves in at midlife. Whether you're a seasoned listener or just joining the adventure, think of this podcast as your hot pink convertible cruising down the highway of change. Together we'll navigate the sometimes baffling backroads of midlife and collect all the cool souvenirs along the way. Get in and buckle up. Our map may have flown out the window miles ago, but that doesn't mean we aren't going to have a blast. Let's hit the road and discover the magic just around the bend. Rosebud Woman was developed in response to women's unaddressed needs for beautiful, luxurious products that provide relief and pleasure, whether it be for period pain, pregnancy, perimenopausal woes, or menopause symptoms. Intimate wellness products are often designed to use with a sexual partner or medicalized to treat a diagnosed issue. Rosebud Woman feels different. It feels ceremonial, like I'm doing a beauty ritual while addressing my 50-plus-year-old body's needs. Their everyday honor balm is gynecology tested and hormone-free. It hydrates, conditions, and replenishes intimate skin. It is excellent for all phases of a woman's life. Go below to my show notes and use the affiliate link for 20% off. My dad was cremated today, and I'm not with him. I'm back in Florida in the aftermath of Hurricane Milton, in the aftermath of sitting with him for the last 2 weeks of his life, while he slowly died, while the life just leaked out of him. It was a really intense experience to sit with him as he slowly faded away. When I went up to Delaware, I actually wasn't expecting my dad to die. I thought that I was going to downsize him and move him from the assisted living side of his facility to the memory care unit. But I think my dad knew that he was going to be moved into memory care, and I think that he just gave up. My dad had dementia, but we didn't really know he had dementia until March of this year when we took him for an evaluation. And when we got that diagnosis, I was surprised that he was much further along than I thought he was going to be staged at. My dad was a really bright guy, but he was also a very unhappy person. He had a lot of trauma in his early childhood, and it prevented him from really being able to connect with people. It's also possible that my dad may have been on the spectrum, but it's hard to know because he never had a diagnosis. He was just a strange, disconnected, internally preoccupied person. When I was in grad school and I was learning about mental illness, I struggled a lot to kind of think like, what is wrong with my dad? My dad was always an odd duck, as they used to say in the 70s. He was a strange guy. He was always having a little chat with himself. He wasn't really connected to other people. He didn't ask other people questions. He didn't know how to socially engage with people. He didn't have great eye contact. None of those things. It's kind of a miracle that he managed to get married and have a family. But I think that the only reason he was able to do that was because it was the 60s. It was what was expected of him. And I think my mom came along and really wanted to rescue him. My dad lost both his parents by the time he was 17. His mom died when he was 12, and his dad died when he was just about 17. And the 5 years between the death of his mother and the death of his dad, I know that my paternal grandfather had descended into severe alcoholism. So my dad didn't grow up with a lot of family support. The only person who was really in charge of him after his dad died was his aunt, who my dad never had anything good to say about. He really seemed to have a lot of resentment towards her, and I'm sure she was a perfectly fine person. I'm sure that she, like all of us, was just flawed and lost and just doing her best. Sitting with my dad while he died was a very interesting and expansive, challenging, and spiritual experience. Like I said, my dad and I did not have a great relationship. He was not a good father. He was a good provider. He went to work every day. He brought his paycheck home. As far as I know, he didn't cheat on my mother. He never hit us. He would threaten to, but he never actually went all the way through with it. I think he just didn't know how to be in a family. And I think that he would have benefited from maybe having my mother all to himself. Maybe he would have been a happier person had he never had children. And that's a really hard thing to sit with. It's a really hard thing to reconcile. The fact that your parent did not want to be a parent and didn't pass along to you any sense of safety, any sense of comfort, any sense of worthiness, any sense of belonging. My dad was just really wrapped up in his own unhappiness. And my brother and my mother and I, we suffered for it. I used to pin a lot of my mother's drinking on my dad's behavior. And I don't know that that's necessarily super fair to him. My mom was definitely a person who made her own choices, but it seemed that the longer she was in this unhappy marriage, the worse her drinking got. And by the time she was my age, her drinking was very, very self-destructive. And she had many, many falls and many injuries from her drinking. But what I really want to talk about today is what I learned about myself just in observance of sitting with my dad in hospice while he was dying, is I had such a strong urge to escape into work. And I really attempted to continue to see clients as my dad was dying. And I realized about halfway through this 2-week process that that was absolutely insane. I was booking people around my schedule of going back and forth to hospice. And I don't think I did anyone, including myself, including my father, including my clients, including anybody, I don't think I did anybody any favors. I don't think I did a great job being a therapist and going back and forth to hospice. And if I had known, if I had had some kind of guarantee that it was only going to be 2 weeks, I think I would have let myself off the hook. I think I could have afforded myself 2 weeks to just be there. But the inconvenience of the entire situation was just extended by Hurricane Milton, which hit Sarasota, where I live, while I was sitting by my father's bedside. And that prevented me from going home immediately after my dad died. I instead went to stay with my brother and my sister-in-law and my nephew for an additional 6 days. And that was something I did not want to do. All I wanted was to go home. All I wanted was to be in my home with my partner, sleeping in my own bed, eating my own food, back in my routine, back in my walks, back in my work. That's all I wanted. But life had other plans. The hurricane came in, our airport was damaged, I could not get home. So I had no choice but to follow my brother back to North Carolina. And in a lot of ways, I'm incredibly grateful for my brother and my sister-in-law's generosity with me. They pretty much left me alone, on my own schedule for the most part. They went to work, so I had the house to myself for most of that time. And I did have some time to quietly reflect on my own, which is what I desperately needed. So I learned a lot about myself and overworking, watching my dad die. My dad was an overworker. My mother was an overworker. My brother appears to be an overworker. He's working on his second pension, and he has a part-time job on top of that. And honestly, he doesn't seem to need the money. He lives in a really beautiful house. He's got a beautiful family. He has a really good life. And I see myself repeating the pattern of overworking. I wasn't going to take a single day off during this entire thing, but I forced myself to take a couple of days off and do nothing after my dad died. And as a new entrepreneur, that was very, very challenging. I was really, really worried. How am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to take care of myself? How am I going to keep the roof over our heads if I take a couple of days off? And the truth of the matter is, I do have a small savings account, and I can take the day off. I can take 2 days off. I could even take 5 days off if I could probably take 3, maybe not 3 weeks. I don't know if I could tolerate not working for 3 weeks, but I could certainly take an entire work week off and be okay. I could do it. I know I can do it. But I'm anxious even musing about it out loud. I don't know what this attachment is to overworking. I don't really know what that's about. But it does feel somewhat like a family curse. It feels like something everyone in my family does. We all throw ourselves into overproductivity, overworking, over-delivering, just people-pleasing, all these things I really want to put down. I really need remedial self-care. Actually, let me rephrase that. No one ever taught me how to take care of myself. Not really. I was told to always be responsible, put other people first, do the right thing. The best thing is to do something for somebody else and not for yourself. All these really damaging lessons that I need to unlearn. And I know that in the wake of my father's death and now having no parents, it's a strange thing to have no parents. It feels like there are no guardrails. There is no one to be accountable for. Or maybe the person I'm finally accountable for and to is myself. Not surprisingly, I got back to Florida. My partner talked me into a day floating in the pool. But when I woke up on Thursday and Friday and Saturday and Sunday, I was sick as a dog. And you probably can hear it in my voice now. I'm still a little bit sick. And that's not really surprising because I hit the fucking wall during this. Sitting with someone when they're dying is incredibly exhausting. And I know it's taboo to say, but sitting with someone who's dying is incredibly boring. You can only say the things that you need to say to somebody so many times. That might take 1 day or half a day, depending on how conflictual your relationship is with them. So I ran out of things to say to my dad, and then I was just repeating myself. And then it became, I don't know how much longer I can sit here. How much longer is he just going to have the life leaking out of him? How much longer am I going to have to come back to this stinky, horrible room that's got green fluorescent light, and I'm going to sit on this hospital chair, and I'm going to sit here in silence, watching him breathe? It was really, really hard. I'm sure it was harder for him. I mean, I'm making this sound like, oh, it was so hard for me. I know, in fact, that because it was one of the last things he said to me when he was still coherent. I know he was scared. I know he was scared. And I did my best to comfort him. And we stroked his hair and we held his hand. And I'm grateful that he had some people come see him. And I'm very, very grateful that a friend that he made after my mom died came to see him. And she was so incredibly generous with him. And she was so strikingly unafraid of the death that was in the room. She just sat on the edge of that hospital bed and she talked to him or talked at him as if he completely was still with us. And she said all kinds of really amazing and kind and generous things to him. And my dad died about 4 hours after she left. And I wonder if he was waiting for her. And she told me when I called her to tell her that my dad had passed that night, she told me she had purposely worn the perfume he had given her, which had belonged to my mother. My dad gave her my mother's leftover perfume, and she wore it that day to the hospital because she knew it would remind him on some level of my mother and that he would go to her. So I'm incredibly thankful to her for her being so thoughtful, for showing up for my dad, showing up for my family, and giving with the utmost generosity. To me, she was practically a stranger, but she was really my dad's friend. And I'm so grateful that he had some friends. I really, really am. I've now sat with both of my parents as they died. And I'm really grateful and glad that I was able to be there for both of them. And I had distinctly different, complicated relationships with each of them. But I'm really, really grateful that I got to be there. I'm really, really grateful that I got to say everything I needed to say. I'm grateful that I have some form of closure with both of my parents. I feel a little untethered, a little unmoored, a little disconnected, not having any parents. But I know now that I'm really just responsible for and to myself. And I plan on taking better care of myself. I plan on prioritizing myself a little bit better. I plan on learning to relax and maybe making a discipline out of rest and making that my mission going forward. So that's my message this week for you. I hope that you can also learn a little bit about self-care, a little bit about discipline. And the discipline of relaxation is really the discipline that's important to learn in midlife. The discipline of taking care of yourself, because when you lose your parents, you become acutely aware of your own mortality, and you know how fragile life is, and you know how temporary we are. And so maybe I could take the next 30 years or so that I might have on this planet and learn to enjoy it just a little bit better. So I think I'm going to pull a card for this episode, and it feels right. I'm shuffling my cards, and it feels good to be back a little bit in my routine. And the card for this episode is the Ace of Swords. The Ace of Swords is about new ideas. It's about being re-inspired. It's about new communication. It's about that big rush of energy when it comes to starting out a new venture. So my new venture this week is to learn how to rest and how to take care of myself and how to prioritize myself. And I'm inviting you to reflect on what lesson you need right now and to focus solely on that. Have a great week. Next week, I'm coming up with a really amazing interview. And I hope that you've been enjoying my interviews, and I hope that you will stay tuned for the next episode, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much for listening to Your Magical Midlife. I'm Kate Higgins, your host. You can follow me on Instagram at Your Magical Midlife. You can also check out my offerings on my website, which is www.yourmagicalmidlife.com. I offer individualized coaching for women 45 plus who are seekers, dreamers, and out-of-box thinkers. I also offer luxury retreats that include ritual, rites of passage, and ceremony for women 45 and beyond. I'd be so excited to work with you. Also, if you're feeling kind and you've enjoyed this episode, please leave me a 5-star review, as it opens this podcast to a broader audience and keeps me in those pesky algorithms. Thank you so much for your partnership with me. I appreciate you. Have a great week.